Hey everyone, as we get started on a new AP United States history year, and as you start your summer work, it's hard for me not to talk a little bit about the kind of big picture stuff. And that as you start to learn some of this information, uh, thinking about what I want you to get out of it, what I want you to be able to do after you've kind of digested all of this information. And these are some things that we want to keep our eyes on as we go throughout the course. And the first thing is just an introduction to thinking like a historian, and I put on here knowing stuff, but beyond that, it's going to be about making a lot of connections. So I want to detail for you how is it that you can think like a historian, making these connections, and what is it the kind of task that you're going to be tasked with to kind of articulate or explain or demonstrate your understanding. So what's the goal here? The goal is to make a historically defensible argument. That means that you're going to say something that stands up to scrutiny and evidence. And so, what we have to do is we have to consider the context in which something happens, examine evidence, consider the source of that evidence, who's saying it, in what context they're saying it, and then utilize that evidence to make broader arguments. So, you're often going to be asked to take a particular perspective on a topic, and then you're going to have to use that evidence to put together an argument as to why that is. So, the biggest one you think about in history is causation. One thing led to another. Well, how did it lead to it, right? Why did stuff happen? What was the impact of that event? And then there's think about the short and the long term, the effects, right? So we're going to see lots of these big calamitous events in American history, and they're going to have these short term causes and these long term causes. And it's helpful to think about that as we gather up these events and these ideas. The next one is continuity and change over time. This was probably the most difficult piece for students to absorb. And that's the idea that things stayed the same over a particular time period, whereas some things changed. And thinking about overall what has changed, what has stayed the same, and why did it change, and how much did it change. So we often have these turning points in American history, and we evaluate how much did things change for people, how much did things change for society, and there we have a lot of those pivot point moments in American society that we're going to look at. A related skill that's not directly tied to, you'll never see a periodization question, but periodization, the skill of it is to say, okay, when did something start and when did something end, right? You're going to look at unit one, and for unit one they say 1491 to 1607. Well, what is 1491? What's the significance of that, and what's the significance of 1607? And why 1607, right? And why not 1620? Why not 1619? Why are these dates? And so this skill is really connected to continuity and change over time, because we're seeing as one event being a turning point. To what extent was Reconstruction a turning point? To what extent did World War One change United States foreign relations? Right. These are turning points. So these are very closely related skills that, although you won't be directly assessed on it, it's a good way of thinking about historical events. Another form of historical thinking is comparison. So similarities, differences between the two here at football and football. So what are the differences and similarities here? But you might say across time periods, the women's rights movement in the 1970s compared to the women's rights movement in the early 1900s. Like what are some similarities there? What are some differences? And then again, going back to the idea of historical evidence, what historical evidence do we have that demonstrates that? Contextualization. So this is a big skill that you're going to see in a lot of the documents. Will ask you, what's the relevant context for this? How did this come about? Connecting the events to their specific time and place in history. So we see a couple of soldiers here. It says, "Welcome to Bush International Airport." So they're making light of the fact that George Bush sort of precipitated this conflict. This is the war in Iraq, and so they're making light of it there. So I couldn't talk about more about this photo. I couldn't really explain what this photo is about without explaining the broader context of it. And I want you to treat just about every document that way, that for every document there is a context surrounding it. Historical argumentation. So I put up a picture here of Trevor Noah because what Trevor Noah does is he very articulately brings together historical evidence to make an argument. And granted, it's his perspective and it's the perspective of the Daily Show. And other people do this as well. But if you watch him very closely, you'll realize that he's trying to construct an argument around the way we should think about particular topics that come up in American news, and evaluating, synthesizing conflicting historical evidence to construct persuasive historical arguments. And sometimes you might even hear him try to talk about the counter side of one argument, and he shuts it down, right? So he's trying to articulate a narrative. And I think a lot of the journalists, or we should say like the pundits, right, they attempt to do this as well. John Oliver does this very convincingly, although they try to attempt to be comedians. I think they're very clearly coming with a particular historical argumentation. Appropriate use of relevant historical evidence. So, in order to make that argument, you're going to have to use relevant historical information, and it needs to be appropriate. So, extracting useful information, making supportable inferences, drawing appropriate conclusions from historical evidence. Interpretation, how you see things. How do perspectives influence people's interpretations of events, and how might these perspectives change over time? So, as you read a historical source, something that we've tried to stress throughout all levels of history courses is that a document is not just, we don't just treat it as a document, we treat it as a set of ideas, and that this person is articulating their ideas from their point of view. What would influence them to make their argument? And finally, we have this concept of synthesis, or this often comes up in what's called the complexity point. um, what this is creating persuasive understanding of the past and its relevance to the present, or connecting it to different time periods. So if you talk about some of the, if you have a question thinking about W.B. Du Bois versus Booker T. Washington in their approach for African American advancement in the post Reconstruction period, which is something you're going to learn about. And then you make a connection to the fact that, oh, wait, there was Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, two African American intellectuals making their case for the future of African Americans in the post World War II era, in the civil rights era. And so you recognize it, like, wait, I've seen this before, right? I've seen these themes before, connecting these ideas together. A lot of times I'll recommend to students to say, like, when we're talking about a particular event, let's press fast forward and see what happens in the future. You're talking about the construction of the Constitution and talking about the battle over, a Bill of Rights, and that they did these in order to secure rights for the individuals. And as we press fast forward, do we see that rights of individuals are protected? Do we see that the government actually gains more power? And there is evidence that we do. So what I want to stress is that I'm going to ask you to learn a lot of information, but in learning that information, it's going to give you broader perspectives, and it's going to give you more evidence to talk about the American past than you have previously. So I hope you look forward to learning a bit of the Unit One, this period of that's mainly focused on Native Americans, but we also get a touch of the Spanish interaction. And so when you go into these lessons, keep in mind of the things that led to other things. What do you see as turning points? Where do you see historical perspectives popping out? Can we compare Spanish colonization? Well, we will compare Spanish colonization to English colonization, and to look at how is it that history is actually shaped. So I hope you found this video informative as a good introduction into Unit 1 and into the rest of this course. And I look forward to discussing this with you, talking about this with you, and talking about some history. So talk to you soon. Thank you very much. Bye.